I still remember the sharp crack that echoed through the kitchen that night, the taste of iron flooding my mouth before I could even register what had happened. My father's hand hadn't just slapped MIT, had driven his fist upward with such force that I heard my jaw pop, a sickening sound that seemed to vibrate in my skull. My knees buckled, my vision blurred, and all I could see through the haze of tears was my mother leaning back in her chair, her lips curling into a grin that was so cold it made my stomach twist. She didn't rush to my side. She didn't ask if I was okay. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, eyes glinting with a cruel satisfaction, and said in a mocking tone, "Now you'll learn to keep that gutter mouth shut." I was only 17, and in that moment, every shred of childish hope that my parents could ever love me dissolved into something darker, something simmering in the pit of my chest. I didn't even know what I had said to set him off. All I remembered was muttering something about how he treated Mom like a queen while he acted like a dictator toward me. I'd thought I was standing up for myself, but the punishment came faster than my words could fade from the air. I stumbled toward the counter, clutching my face, and the metallic temps of blood mixed with the faint smell of the overcooked stew on the stove. My father sat back down at the table like nothing had happened, continuing his dinner, occasionally glancing at me with a look that dared me to say another word. My mother took another spoonful of food and chuckled under her breath. That night, as I sat on my bed holding a bag of frozen peas against my swelling jaw, I wasn't thinking about crying or begging for mercy. I was thinking about payback, deliberate and absolute. I wanted them both to feel a pain that wouldn't fade with ice or time, and I knew one day I'd get it. The next morning, my jaw was stiff, and every movement sent a jolt of pain radiating through my skull, but I kept my mouth shut. I had learned that silence was safer in a house like ours, not because it made things better, but because it gave me time to think. At breakfast, Dad sat at the head of the table, scrolling through his phone like a king surveying his kingdom, while Mom hummed some old tune, buttering his toast as if she was serving royalty. Neither of them looked at me, not even when I reached for the cereal. It was as if my existence had been reduced to a shadow in the corner. I chewed slowly, feeling every grind of my molars like a reminder of the night before. But in that silence, I was studying them, memorizing every detail, the smug lift of Dad's chin, the way Mom's eyes followed his every move, the unspoken arrogance they shared. They thought they had broken me, but in reality, they had just stripped away the last layer of restraint I had left. I went to school that day with the hood pulled low, but I didn't hide from my thoughts. I started mapping out the contours of revenge, not the kind that comes with shouting matches or throwing things, but the kind that crushes from the inside out. I'd overheard enough in this house to know where their weaknesses were. Dad's pride was tied to his reputation. He was a foreman at a local construction company, respected in the community, the guy everyone trusted with big projects. Mom's weakness was her image. She thrived on the admiration of the church ladies, always volunteering for bake sales and charity events just so she could parade her perfect family image in front of them. I realized if I was going to get back at them, it had to hit where it hurt most. Over the following weeks, I started collecting, not money information. I paid attention to Dad's calls when he was careless enough to take them in the living room, jotting down names, dates, and shady side deals I didn't think his boss would approve of. I noticed how Mom borrowed money from the church fund for her own shopping trips, always promising to put it back but never doing it. Every smile they wore in public started to look like a mask I could rip off piece by piece, but I didn't act right away. No, I let the tension grow. I still washed dishes when told, still took out the trash, still kept my grades up, making myself as invisible as possible while I built a silent arsenal. By the time winter rolled around, my jaw had healed, but my resolve had hardened into something sharper than bone. They thought they had taught me a lesson. What they didn't know was that I was about to become their best student in the art of destruction. And when I finally made my move, it wouldn't just break their pride, it would dismantle the little empire they had built, brick by brick, smile by smile, until nothing was left but the truth they tried so hard to hide. By the time spring arrived, I had enough ammunition to ruin them, but I wasn't ready to pull the trigger, not yet. I wanted their downfall to be slow, like a rot they couldn't see until the walls caved in around them. I started with small cracks, the kind no one notices until they widen beyond repair. At school, I became friends with people who had connections, kids whose parents worked in local businesses, city offices, and even in the police department. I didn't tell them my story. Instead, I asked questions like I was just curious about how things worked. From one conversation in the library, I learned that my father's company had strict rules about subcontractors and safety inspections. And from another, I discovered that falsifying hours on a project report could cost someone their job and their reputation overnight. I kept my ears open for anything that sounded like an opportunity. And it didn't take long before I heard Dad bragging on the phone about cutting corners on a big job to save his boss money. He laughed, saying they'd never notice as long as the paperwork looked clean. That was when I started recording every call, every slip of his tongue, every boast about deals made under the table. With Mom, it was even easier. She was sloppy with her lies, always thinking she was the smartest person in the room. I watched her pull $20 bills from the church collection envelope and slip them into her purse when no one was looking. I noticed the expensive scarf she wore one Sunday, one I'd seen in the boutique downtown with a price tag that could have fed a family for weeks. I started taking pictures, her hand in the collection envelope, the boutique receipt in her coat pocket, the timestamps that lined up perfectly with her supposed volunteer work. But my plan wasn't just about gathering dirt, it was about planting seeds. I began making subtle comments to people in their circles, questions disguised as idle curiosity. Hey, I thought your dad's company had to follow strict safety codes. Do they ever bend the rules? Or I saw your mom at the boutique last Thursday. Doesn't she volunteer at the church on Thursdays? I never accused. I never pointed fingers. I just let the questions linger, knowing how gossip grows legs in small towns. Meanwhile, at home, I played the part of the obedient child. I let them believe I was still that quiet, beaten-down version of myself, the one too scared to fight back. But in my head, I was moving pieces on a chessboard only I could see. I knew the day was coming when I'd topple their king and queen in one swift move. And when that day came, they'd never see it coming, not from the kid they thought they had silenced forever. It started small, just as I'd planned, like the first hairline cracks in a dam. One afternoon in early May, I overheard my father cursing into his phone in the garage, his voice low but sharp. Someone had called him about a strange question. They'd been asked regarding safety procedures on one of his recent projects. He hung up quickly when he noticed me lingering near the doorway, glaring at me as if I'd been the one to make the call. I just shrugged and walked away, hiding the smirk that was threatening to break across my face. That was the beauty of it. I didn't need to do everything myself. Once the right seeds were planted, the people in their own world would do the rest. At the church, Mom's perfect image started to chip away. Sister Margie, one of the older women who never missed a Sunday service, cornered her in the hallway. One morning, I didn't hear the whole conversation, but I caught enough to see Mom's smile twitch into something brittle. By the time we were in the car, her jaw was tight, and she snapped at Dad about nosy people sticking their noses where they don't belong. I sat in the back seat, feigning interest in my phone, but inside, I could feel the pressure building. Over the next few weeks, little things began to happen. Dad's boss showed up unexpectedly on a job site, clipboard in hand, checking measurements and safety equipment. Mom was suddenly left out of a few church committee decisions, replaced by women she used to talk down to. I knew these were just ripples, but soon they'd be waves, big enough to knock them off their feet. I decided to accelerate the process. I made anonymous calls, one to the regional safety inspector's office about possible violations on Dad's latest project, and another to the church treasurer, suggesting that there might be a discrepancy in the collection funds. My voice was calm, careful, and rehearsed, just a concerned citizen with no direct involvement. I could almost feel their world tightening around them like a noose. At home, Dad was more irritable than ever, snapping at Mom over little things, slamming his beer bottles down harder on the table. Mom's once effortless confidence began to crack. She started double-checking receipts, rifling through her purse like she was worried something might be missing. They didn't suspect me, not yet. To them, I was still the silent, obedient child who kept to my room. But, in reality, every night, I was reviewing my recordings, organizing my photos, and drafting an anonymous packet of evidence that would land on exactly the right desks when the time was perfect. I didn't just want them to lose face. I wanted them to feel powerless, humiliated, and stripped of every ounce of false superiority they'd ever used to crush me. By early summer, the air around our house felt different, thicker, heavier, like a storm was brewing, but no one knew when the lightning would strike. I could see it in their eyes every time the phone rang. Dad would pause before answering, his brow furrowing, as if bracing himself for bad news. Mom had started checking the caller ID more than she checked her own reflection in the mirror, which for her was saying a lot. That was when I knew the timing was perfect. I packaged everything I had collected into 2 separate envelopes. The first contained every damning detail about Dad, recordings of his phone calls, photos of incomplete safety measures on his sites, and even a statement from one of his own workers, who had once complained offhandedly to me about being told to fudge the numbers on the paperwork. I mailed it anonymously to his boss's home address. The second envelope was for the church elders, filled with snapshots of Mom's sticky fingers in the collection plate, receipts for her shopping sprees, and the timestamps from her supposed volunteer days that showed she'd been anywhere but helping the needy. I didn't just drop these into a mailbox and hope for the best. I timed their arrival for a Friday afternoon, when they'd sit in the recipients' homes all weekend, festering and eating away at trust before Monday could bring any calm explanations. By Sunday morning, the first bomb had already dropped. At the church, whispers turned into open stares, and I caught the treasurer, Mr. Givens, watching Mom like a hawk as she walked past. She tried to smile her usual perfect smile, but her eyes were darting, scanning the room for answers she couldn't find. Dad's reckoning came a day later. He walked in from work with a look I'd never seen before. Not anger, not even frustration, but a kind of stunned disbelief. His boss had confronted him with the evidence, demanding explanations he didn't have. He tried to bluster his way through, but the recordings didn't lie. By midweek, he was suspended pending a full investigation. At home, the tension turned toxic. They snapped at each other over dinner, slammed doors, and left the TV blaring to drown out the silence between arguments, and I sat back and watched, keeping my face neutral while my mind savored every crack in their facade. The best part was, they still didn't know it was me. They thought the world was turning against them, that friends and colleagues had betrayed them, that bad luck had finally caught up. I let them believe it because that kind of uncertainty is its own kind of torture. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. Public humiliation was only the appetizer. I had a main course plan that would make them choke on every cruel word and every act of violence they'd ever thrown my way. The day the real explosion happened began like any other gray skies. The hum of traffic outside, and the faint smell of stale coffee drifting from the kitchen. But by noon, the storm I'd been crafting for months finally broke. I'd been saving one final piece of evidence for maximum impact, a full, neatly organized dossier that linked Dad's shady construction practices to a recent minor accident on a job site, an accident the company had brushed off as worker negligence. The truth was uglier. I had photos showing missing safety rails, falsified inspection sheets, and a worker's text to Dad asking if they should fix the railing before Monday, to which Dad had replied, "Don't bother. No one's checking this week." I packaged it all and sent it directly to the local newspaper's investigative desk, along with an anonymous statement that hinted at a larger web of corruption within the company. On the same morning, I forwarded the church packet to the regional diocese office, making sure it was marked as urgent misconduct involving funds. By mid-afternoon, my phone was buzzing with alerts, headlines starting to appear online, social media posts speculating about the foreman at Westwood, construction under investigation for safety violations, and whispers about a church treasurer's assistant facing allegations of misappropriating funds. The names weren't printed yet, but in a small town like ours, it wouldn't take long for everyone to put the pieces together. When Dad came home that evening, he didn't slam the door or bark orders. He just stood in the hallway, pale and hollow-eyed, holding his phone like it was a grenade about to go off. Mom followed an hour later, her makeup smeared, clutching her purse to her chest as though it might shield her from the stares she'd gotten at the grocery store. They didn't speak to each other, and for the first time in years, they didn't speak to me either. It was like they were both drowning and too busy fighting for air to notice the lifeboat wasn't coming. That night, I lay in bed listening to the muffled sound of their voices, arguing no longer about me, but about the people who must have set them up, the so-called friends who turned their backs, and the bosses and elders who had betrayed them. The irony made me smile in the dark. They still didn't realize that the real betrayal had been brewing under their own roof, at the hands of the silent kid they thought they had broken. And the best part, I wasn't finished. I still had the one card left that would not just strip them of their reputations, but ensure they'd never recover the comfort and control they once lorded over me. The final card wasn't something I'd stumbled upon, it was something I'd built deliberately, piece by piece, like the slow tightening of a vice. For months, I'd been quietly backing up everything: the photos, the recordings, the receipts, the whispers from their own social circles, and even public records that painted them as more than just morally rotten. They were legally vulnerable. But there was one thing I'd never told anyone, not even in hints: the night my father smashed my jaw. I'd been on a video call with my friend Dylan. He had seen the entire thing unfold: the blow, my fall to the ground, my mother's laugh. Without me knowing at the time, he'd recorded it, mostly because he thought I might need proof someday. I'd buried that clip deep in a hidden folder. But now, with their lives already crumbling in the eyes of the community, it was time to turn that private shame into a public reckoning. I didn't post it outright. That would have been too obvious, too easy to trace back. Instead, I created a brand new anonymous account on a local community forum, one notorious for chewing up scandals and spitting them back out into the public square. I posted the clip there with a short caption: "This is how some parents treat their kids behind closed doors." No names, no dates, just the raw footage. But anyone in town who had seen us together at church or in the grocery store would know exactly who those people were. The response was immediate and vicious. Within hours, the post had hundreds of comments, some expressing horror, others demanding that the police get involved. By the next day, someone had mirrored the clip on Facebook, tagging the local child welfare office and the police department. That was the spark I'd been waiting for. The authorities didn't come knocking right away, but the whispers turned into shouts. At the gas station, I overheard two women discussing that video and how disgusting it was. At school, teachers looked at me differently, not with pity exactly, but with a sharp awareness they'd never had before. And at home, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to desperate. Dad stayed in his room most of the time, curtains drawn, phone buzzing with calls he didn't answer. Mom stopped going to church entirely, muttering about needing to lay low, while she frantically deleted her social media profiles. They were cornered animals now, snapping at shadows, too busy trying to plug the leaks to realize the flood had already consumed the house. And as I watched them drown in their own lies and violence, I felt something I hadn't in years: not guilt, not fear, but an unshakable sense of justice. The collapse didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It came in waves, each one stripping away another piece of the life they had clung to so tightly. The first wave hit on a Thursday morning, when two unmarked cars pulled up in front of the house. I was sitting on the porch pretending to scroll through my phone, but my ears were tuned to every word. Two officers stepped out, knocking firmly on the door. Dad answered, still in his pajamas, eyes bloodshot, hair unkempt. They spoke to him in low tones, but I caught phrases like "follow up on workplace violations" and "formal statement required." His voice wavered in reply, and though he tried to keep calm, I could see his hands tremble as he signed the paper they handed him. When they left, he slammed the door so hard it rattled the picture frames, then stormed into the kitchen to crack open a beer before noon. The second wave came for Mom just 2 days later. A representative from the regional diocese arrived, accompanied by two elders from the church. I made sure to stay out of sight in the hallway, listening as they laid out the evidence: receipts, surveillance, timestamps, and missing funds tallied down to the dollar. Mom tried to deny it at first, then attempted to play the victim, insisting she was being targeted by jealous women in the congregation. But her voice cracked under the weight of their questions, and within minutes, the conversation turned to terms like restitution and permanent removal from committee duties. By the time they left, she was slumped in a chair, staring blankly at the wall like she'd aged 10 years in an hour. And still, they didn't suspect me. That was the part that twisted the knife in deeper. They believed the outside world had conspired against them, that bad luck and false friends had orchestrated their downfall. I let them cling to that fantasy because the truth, that their own child had orchestrated every single blow, it have destroyed them in a way even I wasn't sure they could survive. But I wasn't after survival, I was after ruin. In the weeks that followed, Dad's job suspension became a termination, the company citing irreparable breach of trust. Mom's absence from church became a permanent exile, her name whispered in grocery store aisles and passed along in hushed gossip at PTA meetings. Our once neat, carefully curated home began to decay. Bills piled up on the counter, repairs went undone, the fridge was half empty. I'd walk through the mess silently, every creak of the floorboards reminding me of the nights I used to tread lightly to avoid waking them. Now, they avoided me. And it was in that avoidance that I felt my victory crystallize, not in their screams or apologies, but in their silence, the same silence they had once used to punish me. It was late August when I decided the time had come for the final confrontation, not because I needed them to know, but because I wanted to see their faces when the truth finally sank in. By then, the house felt like a tomb. Dad spent most of his days in the living room, slouched on the couch with the TV blaring, an army of empty bottles lining the coffee table. Mom barely left the bedroom, emerging only to pick at whatever scraps of food we had left. The power of their voices, the shouting, the scolding, the cruel laughter was gone. What remained were two hollow people, stripped of the arrogance they once wore like armor. I waited until a humid Sunday evening, when the air was thick and oppressive, and I knew they'd be too tired to argue. I walked into the living room and stood in front of the TV until Dad finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw slack. Mom appeared in the doorway, her face pale, suspicion flickering in her gaze. "Do you know why all of this happened?" I asked, my voice calm, steady, almost gentle. Dad frowned, glancing at Mom, as if expecting her to answer. "Because people are jealous," he muttered, the same excuse he'd been clinging to for months. I shook my head. "No, it happened because I made it happen." The silence that followed was almost tangible, like the air itself had frozen. I told them everything: how I'd recorded Dad's calls, photographed Mom's thefts, mailed the evidence to the right people, even released the video of the night he broke my jaw. With every word, their faces shifted confusion to disbelief, disbelief to shock, and finally, a raw, unfiltered anger. But beneath that anger was something else: fear. Not fear of what I might do next, but fear of realizing that the child they'd dismissed, belittled, and beaten had been capable of dismantling their lives with precision. "You think this makes you better than us?" Mom hissed, her voice trembling. "No," I said, leaning forward just enough for them to see the calm. "In my eyes, it makes me free." I didn't stay to watch them splutter and curse. I'd already won. The confrontation wasn't about victory, it was about closure. About walking out of that living room knowing I had returned every ounce of pain they'd given me, multiplied tenfold. And as I went back to my room, shutting the door behind me, I realized that the silence in the house had changed. It wasn't the oppressive, threatening silence of my childhood. This was the silence of a battlefield after the fight is over. Final and absolute. In the weeks after that confrontation, the house became something I no longer recognized: not a prison, not even a home, but a hollow shell I was just passing through. Dad stopped looking me in the eye altogether, as if avoiding my gaze could erase the fact that his downfall had come from within his own walls. Mom retreated even further, her days spent scrolling aimlessly on a battered phone, clinging to whatever scraps of gossip she could find to distract herself from her own ruined reputation. The stares in town followed them everywhere: at the gas station, in the grocery store, even at the post office. No one offered sympathy. Their names had become cautionary tales, whispered with a mix of disgust and fascination. I, on the other hand, felt a strange lightness I hadn't known in years. I walked through the school hallways without flinching at every loud voice, without bracing myself for some hidden blow. Teachers treated me differently too, not with pity, but with a kind of respect, as if they understood now that I'd survived something most people couldn't imagine. But revenge, as satisfying as it had been, wasn't the end. It was a doorway. I started looking for ways to get out: college applications, part-time jobs, anything that could build a bridge away from the wreckage of this house. I sold some old things online, saved every dollar, and by the start of winter, I had enough to put down a deposit on a small apartment in the next town over. The day I left, I didn't tell them where I was going. I didn't leave a note. I just walked out with my bags, locking the door behind me for the last time. As I stood on the sidewalk waiting for my ride, I glanced back once. Through the thin curtains, I could see Dad slumped in his chair, staring at the muted TV, and Mom pacing the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear. They looked smaller, somehow less like the towering figures of my childhood, and more like broken people trapped in the ruins of their own making. I turned away, breathing in the cold air, and felt the weight of years lift off my shoulders. They had tried to teach me a lesson about keeping my gutter mouth shut, but in the end, I had taught them something far more permanent. The quiet ones aren't weak. We're just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when we do, there's no going back.